Thanks for being perfectly on time as us. Small hiccup for organizing the session. So very welcome to everyone to this session. I'm very happy to take you through this session on scenarios for biodiversity and nature contributions to people. And this session is co-organized by myself and Rob Alkemaat from Wageningen University and Detlef Vuren from PBL. I'm trying to go to the next slide. I succeeded. So we are going to go very quickly through 7 presentations. I just want to remind everyone that the goal of this session is not necessarily to discuss specific elements of linking between SSPs and RCPs and the biodiversity scenarios, but just to cover recent research work on scenarios for biodiversity and nature contributions to people. We will go through 7 oral presentations, 3 of them remotely, and just want to remind you that there will be 2 posters that are actually running in the session at the very end of our session. So when you are done, just run to the poster session to see the nice posters from Martin and Quinn. And there are also 5 virtual posters that are all providing interesting insights that might also be very relevant for the next link to this scenario workshop, which is the discussion workshop on Wednesday about the link between the SSPs and RCPs. Thanks a lot. So I'm just now going to give it over the chair to Rob Alkemaat, and just a few housekeeping rules. The presenters have 11 minutes to talk and 5 minutes of question. I will be keeping the time. And 1 minute before the end of the presentation, ring this little bell without trying to be too disruptive. And normally everything with the online setup should be now fixed. I hope this will be the case. And enjoy the presentations.
Okay, welcome everybody, and let's start for the presentations. And Kazuaki Tsuchiya has his first presentation, but it's a remote one, and it's pre-registered, so it should be fine.
Kazuaki Tsuchiya from National Institute for Environmental Studies in Japan. My presentation is based on a global modeling study on the impact of protected areas on land use and biodiversity. Recently, SSPs and sometimes RCPs, or radiative forcing level, have been widely used in global biodiversity studies. However, various direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity change have not been fully considered in SSPs. In particular, relationships between protected area policies, which is an indirect driver, and land uses, a direct driver, and biodiversity are not sufficiently explicit in SSPs. Combining SSPs with protected area scenarios can be a starting point toward building integrated biodiversity climate change scenarios. This figure explains about combined impacts of protected areas, climate change, land use change, and biodiversity. At the top, SSPs with radiative forcing level can influence future land use and climate change, and protected areas are an additional driver of regulate the allocation of land use. And those climate and land use variables can be used to estimate future conditions of terrestrial biodiversity. So based on this framework, we came up with 2 research questions for this study. First, can expansion of protected areas help protecting biodiversity under future land use and climate change? And second, does the impact of protected areas on biodiversity differ among regions, time horizons, and SSPs? This study uses Asia-Pacific Integrated Model, or AIM, an integrated assessment modeling framework to explore the role of protected areas. Starting from the aggregated land use for 17 global regions from AIM Hub, a CZE model, the spatial arrangement of protected areas is incorporated into AIM Plan, a land use allocation model at a grid scale of 0.5 degrees. In AIM Hub, Afforestation and by-crops are considered as land-based mitigation measures. And in this study, land use are aggregated to 5 major categories: forest, cropland, pasture, as grassland, urban, and used in AIM biodiversity model. AIM biodiversity is a species distribution model across 5 taxa, including plants, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The AIM biodiversity model uses Maxent model as a basis and can consider the effects of climate and land use change on habitat suitability and also dispersal ability of species. Note that this time we only use single GCM, so not fully accounting future climate uncertainty. The final output from AIM biodiversity is extent of suitable habitat areas, and this is represented as a relative value, and year 2010 score is set to 1. And in this study, we used a geometric mean value for about 1,900 selected species. In this study, we used 6 scenarios, which are combinations of 3 SSPs with different forcing levels, and 2 protected areas, assumptions, baseline, and extended. 2010, 2050, and 2090 are selected as time horizons, and biodiversity scores are analyzed in both global and regional scales. Here I briefly explain about the treatment of protected areas in our model. In each grid, total amount of forest and other grassland, which is not included pastures, should be more than the coverage of protected areas. In baseline scenario, we use current strictly protected areas 1A, B, 2, and 3 IUCN categories, and in extended scenario, we consider all WDPA categories. We also add key biodiversity areas as an additional protected areas in extended scenario. So here I explain several results from our study. These figures show how cropland use, one of major land use type, were different among 2 protected area assumptions, baseline and extended. Purple colors mean reduced amount of cropland when protected areas are extended, and green colors mean opposite cases. We found reduced cropland ratios in extended protected area grids as expected, and when compared these 3 SSP cases, we found that impacts of protected areas on land use differ among SSPs, and less visible in SSP 1 to 6 and more visible in 245 and 370. This is probably because of difference in population and land use demand among SSPs. We can also see regional differences, as impacts are larger in Africa and Europe than in other regions. This slide shows changes in biodiversity scores under 6 scenarios. X-axis shows temporal dimension and Y-axis shows biodiversity scores. In general, biodiversity scores decrease across all scenarios throughout studied periods, and for all SSPs, 2 protected area assumptions did not influence biodiversity scores clearly at the global scale. When we compare 3 SSPs, biodiversity scores were best in SSP 1 to 6 and worst in 370. One of the highest biodiversity scores were observed in SSP 1 to 6 with extended protected area scenarios, the dark green one, but this scenario may not be sufficient for achieving nature positive in this century based on our results. And this is the last result slide, and this is about regional differences. In these figures, just like previous slides, x-axis shows temporal dimensions, and this time y-axis shows how much biodiversity score different in extended protected area scenarios compared to baseline. So for example, in this SSP 1 to 6 scenario, biodiversity scores in North Africa is 2.5% higher when protected areas are extended. in 2019. Each line represents different regions, and this time I highlighted results from Africa in these figures because we found relatively larger impacts of protected areas in Africa than in other regions. By comparing these three SSPs, we found that regional impacts were different across SSPs and also across time. For example, protected areas were most beneficial in sub-Saharan Africa under SSP 370, but not in other SSPs. We also found negative impacts of extended protected areas on biodiversity, such as this North Africa case. And one possible reason for this is spillover effects of protected areas, which mean land use change in outside protected areas affect negatively on regional biodiversity. So here I briefly wrap up my presentation. In this study, we found that the impact of protected areas on terrestrial biodiversity can be different among regions. We also found that the regional impact can be different under various socioeconomic and climate scenarios represented in SSP with radiating forcing level. And based on this result, current internationally agreed priority areas, KBA, may not be sufficient for protecting habitat under long-term global changes. And there's also some limitations of our research. We did not clearly consider feedback between protected areas and food system, which may change biodiversity outcomes. So future study may need to consider such complex biodiversity food land climate nexus in more precise manner. Here's some additional thoughts based on our study. I came up with several open questions on the relationships between nature futures and SSPs and wondered if NFF can help describe protected areas with SSPs. I assume that NFF will help extend the scope of protected area policies, particularly because our study has only narrow scope to nature for nature dimension. But I'm not so sure whether NFF can be consistent with all SSPs, as some of them often assume weak environmental regulations. Another thought is that it might be useful if NFF can work as a unified dimension of biodiversity, just like radiative forcing levels in climate studies. I don't have answers to this question yet, but hopefully deal with some of them in future works. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Kazuaki, are you online or?
Yes.
Ah, good. So you can answer questions. That's good.
Yes.
So, are there any questions for this? Mark, please. Yeah. It's on. I think it's on. Yeah.
Getting solved.
Thank you. We know that as well as land use and land cover change, the intensity of use is really critical in understanding impacts on biodiversity. So in your modelling framework, were you also able to consider different levels of management intensity? So for example, cropland, there's an enormous range of different ways in which croplands can be managed, which has enormous implications for biodiversity. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you very much. I agree with that point, but unfortunately, we cannot consider that intensity so far. We just simply including 5 different land use types.
Okay, thank you.
Hi.
Yeah?
Can I go? Okay, yes. Hi, I'm Justin Johnson. Thank you for the great presentation. I was wondering if you'd share more thoughts on the spillover point that you made for the spillover biodiversity, where it increased biodiversity in I forget the region, sub-Saharan Africa, and then shifted it north. Do you have any thoughts about what was driving that particular spillage, or do you have any other thoughts you could share on that?
Yes, based on our analysis, we assume that certain amount of demand is allocated outside protected areas. So if the biodiversity value is relatively high outside protected areas, such spillover effect can cause negative as a total for all certain regions.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions from the room? No, there's one online question. So the question is, the level of protection should be dependent on the SSPs considered. Why didn't you consider that dependency of the SSPs and the protected areas?
I think it's a bit complicated things to consider the combinations between protected areas with SSPs, and this is just preliminary study to test the available combinations based on SSPs and protected area assumptions. And thank you very much for your comment. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the interesting presentation. Thank you. Bye bye. And the next speaker is Patrick Fourierza from Potsdam Institute Climate Change. So please go ahead. This is easy, just forward, backward.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to speak in this session. Today I will be talking about what happens if you zoom in the global land system assessment, quite an important process, and I'm representing quite a lot of people with this work, so this is obviously not my work alone. So what is the motivation of doing this? So pressing this zoom button in a global land system model, nature contributions to people are declining globally. Different direction. And we know that landscape scale changes play a very important role in this decline. This is just to show how many nature contributions to people are actually dependent on landscape properties in general. And to be a bit more quantitative, this review by Denise et al. Has shown that agricultural production is actually impacted by changes in landscape properties, in this case landscape simplification, mediated through changes in species richness, affecting supplies like pollination and pest control. And the questions that I'm trying to address today is how do growing pressures in the land system actually affect landscapes in the future, and what are the consequences for key regulating NCPs, which are normally overlooked in global land system assessments. And then the second question that I'm trying to answer is what are the trade-offs of safeguarding regulating NCP in these agricultural landscapes. So I'm very much focusing on the instrumental values of the nature dimension. So what are the entry points of assessing NCPs in a global land system? So the classic perspective is always looking at amounts of land, so land use changes in habitat amounts. For example, if you have a forest patch, you could expect that it will provide a certain supply of NCPs like carbon sequestration, etc. This is very prominent in many global assessments. It is not false, but it is, the relationship can change a bit as well. But this is, of course, not the full story. And complementary to this story is that landscape context also matters. So if you look at processes like pest control or pollination, landscape context and how spatial configuration in the landscape changes is key. And how did we do that? So the center of our work is the global land system model MAGPIE, which has been applied in many studies related to land use change, but also sustainable development. And we basically use this, this global assessment model and couple it with a downscaling algorithm, which has been developed by Justin Johnson, who is also sitting here in this room, which we use to downscale MAGPIE results to a spatial resolution of 300 by 300 meters. And with these land cover maps at this resolution, we derive two indicators for key nature contributions to people in agricultural landscapes: pollination sufficiency on the one hand and soil erosion on the other hand. So how do we define pollination sufficiency? Just very briefly, so we rank cropland pixels basically according to the proportional occurrence of semi-natural habitat in the surrounding of cropland. So 1 indicates that they have 30% of semi-natural habitat around cropland, and values between 0 and 1 indicate that we have a proportion of 1 to 30. So this is basically an indicator that relies on empirical findings that having at least 30% of semi-natural habitat within a 2-kilometer range of cropland provides a sufficient supply of wild pollination. And secondly, it's also an indicator basically for a configurational landscape structure in a more general term. And which scenarios do we look at? So this study is another SSP2-based study, contributing to this large pie of SSP2-based studies. So we look at the business as usual scenario as a reference scenario, as a control. And the aim is basically to increase pressure in the land system and see how these key regulating NCPs react to this increased pressure. So the next scenario is a protection scenario where we enlarge protected areas to reach a total land share of 30% at the global scale. And then we combine this with a carbon uptake program, a carbon uptake policy that is conducive to reaching the 1.5 degree target in the land system. So ramping up land pressure, so pressure in the land system. And then in the last scenario, we look at what happens if, under these circumstances, we also add a goal of maintaining 20% of semi-natural habitat at the landscape scale. And this is based on work by Garibaldi et al. That suggested that in order to sustain many different critical nature contributions to people at the landscape scale, we need at least 20% of native habitat. And that is also to sustain habitats for threatened species, etc. So where if species don't have a place to live, of course, they can also not fulfill their benefits to society. So what happens? So these are changes in pollination sufficiency. So the top map shows the state for 2015, and the bottom panel basically shows the changes between 2015 and 2050. And let's look only at low pollination sufficiency values and high pollination sufficiency values. So what we see that across the business as usual scenario as well as the nature protection scenarios, we see that low values, so homogeneous landscapes, tend to increase over time. And also the carbon uptake scenario is not doing much to improve the situation that we currently observe. We also see that in the high category, so heterogeneous landscapes that experience enough pollination, we see increases in the business as usual scenario and the protect scenario. And this comes with trade-offs because this is related to cropland expansion into natural areas. So we see at the agriculture frontier that landscape heterogeneity actually increases. But of course, as we will see later, this will come with increased emissions from land use change, increased soil erosion, and of course, increased land conversion. But we see that in the multi-scenario, where we have less cropland expansion, as we will also see later, the multi-scenario is the only scenario that manages to address the issue of landscape simplification. Just briefly, changes in soil loss, as we would have expected. Cropland expansion is the largest driver of soil loss. So we see huge increases, a doubling of soil loss basically by 2015, driven by cropland expansion, which is only slightly reduced in the protect scenario. We see high synergies with the carbon uptake policy. And yeah, slight trade-offs if we introduce the landscape policy due to a spatial relocation of cropland. And do we find trade-offs? And this is just exemplary. We looked at many more indicators. Let's look at carbon emissions first. So as we would have expected, only in the coaction scenarios, net carbon emissions from land use change actually become positive. So negative emissions are basically losses from ecosystems, so don't get twisted with the axis. And we see that if we introduce the landscape policy, basically this does not lead to trade-offs with regard to carbon emissions. And this is also reflected in land use change, basically. So we don't see an additional cropland expansion due to the introduction of the semi-natural habitat vegetation policy. And this is basically because we only see, sorry, I have to put it differently. We mainly see shifts in spatial land use patterns and only slight increases in the intensification of cropland. So let me conclude. So the expansion and the appropriation of material goods could reinforce observed negative trends in key regulating NCP, which is actually not a surprising finding, but yeah, a baseline finding of the study. So sustaining 20% of semi-natural habitat at the landscape scale does not generate trade-offs regarding carbon emissions and land conversion. And yeah, normally global optimization models usually favor specialization. That's just how they are built, basically. But taking the landscape perspective provides, the last point, provides a more balanced perspective. Just to mention, yeah, related to your question from the other talk, intensification is unfortunately not a process that we can cover so far. So this is, yeah, the impacts of intensification are not considered here. Yeah, thanks a lot. Happy to hear your questions.
So, any questions from the room? Yeah, Dylan?
Thanks, and I might even slip in two questions. Maybe one, really interesting, really cool work, and excited to see it. In terms of pollination and pollination sufficiency, you've really looked at the supply side, but kind of crop types really do or do not depend on pollination to quite an extent. So to what extent, yeah, would it be possible basically to take that into account, and what would be needed to do that? And a quick one in terms of forest patches and size and carbon emissions. There is some work, especially in tropical areas. Forest edges basically have lower carbon concentration than forest materials. So again, is there an additional potential kind of trade-off of these small forest patches? Also in terms of climate change.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much for these two questions. So they're really hitting the point. So regarding the forest patches, yeah, so we have a mixed picture. I've also looked at the literature regarding this. So we have a mixed picture. We see that, for example, hedges and these kinds of landscape features, as a study from Braunschweig has also shown that this can actually have similar carbon uptake potential as natural forests. But we also see, as you have mentioned, that studies point in the other way. So there's a bit, yeah, it's a bit uncertainty how this will play out in the real world. But this is, yeah, this may be one limitation that we cannot, as to this point, cannot quantify that yet. And the second question with closing the loop, basically, so how does pollination then affect crops in the end? So at the moment, so we're not able to run this model iteratively, so we cannot downscale it, estimate pollination sufficiency, and then put it back into the model. But this will definitely be some work for the future. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's a question over there.
Ah, yeah.
Don't want to make you run, Detlef. Thanks a lot. I find that very interesting. I was wondering to what extent is the spatial demand or requirement of species considered in this approach? Or is this just focusing on carbon binding and pollinator success and things like that?
Yeah, I think I would have loved to do that as well, but time constraints. But I'm working on that too. So I have actually with an intern of mine who did a lot of very nice work on species modeling and estimates of area of habitat requirements. This is not included in this study so far, but we're thinking about this issue too, and hopefully broaden the picture in the future. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Mark, last question, I think.
Yeah, so thanks for answering my other question in point 4. That's very good. I just thought I'd make a comment about the famous SSP2 question that keeps coming up. And I'm just wondering, I mean, in the biodiversity world, maybe the problem is that the SSPs are actually just not that helpful when it comes to doing biodiversity assessments. Do you think that that actually explains why we see this preponderance of SSP2 worlds, because it's just taken as a business as usual?
Yeah. I'm not quite sure whether I understand the word preponderance in that sentence.
A large number of studies around SSP2 instead of the other SSPs.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. So to be honest, I think for this study we stuck to SSP2 because we thought, yeah, it is a kind of a middle of the road scenario, so not going into these extremes. We also did sensitivity analysis for other SSPs, but the results remain consistent across the different SSPs even. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. It would actually be nice to have the other SSPs as well in the same thing.
Yeah.
To analyze that would be good. Thank you. So next speaker is Sarah Jones, who is also remote and has a pre-recorded contribution. So.
Hi everyone,
Yeah,
I'm Sarah
there it
Jones
is.
from the Alliance of Biodiversity International in Seattle. I am going to be talking about work we've been doing at Fable to identify pathways for food and land use systems to contribute to sustainability targets and specifically to the CBD's global biodiversity targets. So biodiversity and food systems are intrinsically dependent on each other and impact on each other. Biodiversity, and specifically agrobiodiversity, sits at the center of food systems. So declines in biodiversity impact negatively on food systems. At the same time, agriculture and the way it's managed has a strong impact on the share of natural land that's available and the quality of that natural land that impacts in turn on biodiversity. Agriculture also impacts on freshwater quality, greenhouse gas emissions, and indirectly on climate regulation, which impacts on trends in biodiversity. So together, biodiversity and food systems are affecting many of the benefits that nature provides to people, and trying to approach the challenges that these two domains face at the same time is one route to finding integrated and effective solutions. And as mentioned, the decline in biodiversity really impacts negatively on food system sustainability. And as we know, we are living through a period of steep decline in biodiversity. That includes agrobiodiversity, so that's crops, pollinators, the fish and livestock, as well as pest control, pest regulators that make up our food and agricultural system. So for example, 75% of crops used for human food are dependent on insect pollination, and many of these crops that are insect pollinated are fruits and vegetables and nuts that are high in nutrients. So a loss of pollinators creates nutrient deficiencies, particularly in vitamin A. And declining soil biodiversity impacts negatively on crop production. Loss of plant genetic resources removes the range of options that's available to help farmers adapt to climate change. And then finally, agrochemicals and monospecies production is very detrimental for animal health and weakens ecosystem health as well. So because of all these interrelationships, at Fable, we wanted to have a look at how trajectories for food and land use systems may impact on some of the global biodiversity targets that are being considered by the Convention for Biological Diversity in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And just quickly, Fable is an approach to developing scenarios and to modeling their impact, which is based around a collaborative research network, which involves researchers from 20 countries. They work to develop realistic, but also ambitious scenarios for the future, and then to model these. And the models that are, the scenarios that are built for 20 countries are combined with 6 rest of the world regions to look at the cumulative impact at the global level. So the countries in green here are the countries that are represented in Fable. And then the rest of the world is grouped together into regionally similar areas, and models are developed for each of the 6 similar areas separately. So in order to have a look at how food and land use systems impact on global biodiversity targets, we first needed to decide which targets to focus on. We thought we selected 3 that we thought were particularly relevant to food and land use systems. The first is goal A, which aims to increase the integrity of all ecosystems with an increase of at least 15% in the area, connectivity, and integrity of natural ecosystems. And this is coupled with milestone A1, which aims to achieve a similar increase, but of 5% by 2030. And then finally, we decided to try and obtain also target 1, which is to retain existing intact and wilderness areas, halt losses of these areas by 2030. And at the moment, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework has not agreed or finalized the decision on which indicators to use. So we established our own indicator to try to track progress towards these 3 what we'll now call targets. And we call this indicator land where natural processes predominate. And the indicator it represents inside Jacobson and All's low impact area dataset, key areas as defined by BirdLife International, and then intact forest landscapes, which were defined by Patalot and All 2016. So the selection of this dataset, or this indicator, was done in consultation with the 20 Fable countries to try and select datasets that correctly identified areas which were thriving in biodiversity and had relatively low human impact. And what we see is that approximately 56% of ice-free land is covered by LMPP, but the distribution is very uneven across biomes, and there's very little LMPP remaining in particularly tropical broadleaf forests and temperate grasslands. So running the 2 scenarios, current trends and sustainable pathway, we found that none of the targets were achieved under current trends. There was a very small increase, 2% increase in LMPP overall by 2050, but quite steep mature forest loss. In comparison, in the sustainable pathway, the 2030 target of a 5% increase was achieved, even a bit of an overachievement. And the 2050 target of a 15% increase was very nearly achieved, but not quite. Mature forest loss and loss of other existing LMPP continued, and but was at a smaller scale than on current trends. And alongside this, food security was obtainable in both pathways, but GHG emissions, so greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, were a lot lower under the sustainable pathway than under current trends. And a few key messages I thought I wanted to highlight. So first of all, countries have very varied starting points. This graph is showing the share of land where natural processes predominate on the y-axis, and then the proportion of that land that is protected on the x-axis. We grouped countries approximately, or we can see three groups of countries. The first, these purple countries, group 1, have a relatively high proportion of land where natural processes predominate, and then groups 2 and 3 have less than 50%. But very different proportions of this land that is protected. And this means that different absolute areas need to be restored to hit the 15% target at national levels. So for example, Australia restores about 75 million hectares of natural land where natural processes predominate. It isn't enough to reach their 15% target at national level because Australia is very large and already has a substantial amount of LMPP. In comparison, India restores a similar amount of land to LMPP, but overshoots the 15% target by a long way and achieves almost 200%, or just over 200% of an increase in LMPP. And this is because there's very little existing LMPP in India, so the potential for increase is much higher. And then the second key message is that food, climate, biodiversity synergies are possible through cross-sector actions. We see positive outcomes for food security and in terms of the number of calories per capita and a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when actions are taken to both shift diets, also make changes to livestock and crop productivity, and manage land use of the change effectively. There will be trade-offs though in some places, and these trade-offs need to be identified and managed, particularly between continuing food production under current trends and trying to achieve biodiversity goals. The third key message is we already know what to do. We know the key leverage points, and this study confirmed the leverage points that have already been identified in other studies. The first key leverage point is to shift diets. We need to move away from diets that consume too many calories, and we also need to shift towards more plant-based diets, not eliminate meat, but to reduce the consumption in places where it's overconsumed. We also need to agroecologically increase crop productivity and livestock density to make better use of the land that we already have under agricultural production and limit agricultural expansion. And this will indeed help put constraints on agricultural expansion. We need to reforest at scale and also restore vegetation, non-forested vegetation, so that biodiversity, natural non-domesticated species have more habitat in which to move about in. We also need to decrease or have smaller increases in population size. Yeah, even with all these things, we weren't able quite to achieve the 50% increase that the CBD are hoping for, and we weren't able to halt mature forest loss, which indicates even more ambitious and larger scale actions are needed to meet global biodiversity targets. So for example, on the bottom row, this is the sustainable pathway and the assumptions that were made across all the countries and regions. And on the top row is the current trends. So we see that there's quite a large difference in agricultural land expansion, but it nonetheless continues under the sustainable pathway. We also see there's a large difference in afforestation, with very little afforestation in current trends compared to 200% increase in the sustainable pathway. But nonetheless, even larger scale actions will be needed, more substantial dietary shifts, halting agricultural expansion everywhere and sooner. restoring much more land to nature and making agriculture part of the solution. So we eliminate hazardous chemicals and increase plant and animal diversity in and around the fields. That's all I've got time for. Please check out the links below to find out more information. And most of what I presented comes from the Fable Biodiversity Brief, which is online at the Food and Land Use Coalition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Are you online? Yeah. No? Yes. Yes. We can't hear you. We can't hear you?
Ah.
Yeah, now we can.
Okay,
yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So, any questions from the room? Please. The back.
Hello, Daniel Mason DeCroze at Cornell University. A question on the leverage points that you mentioned there. In the work that you've done with Fable, was there any discussion in terms of how you would achieve the dietary shifts? Because calling that a leverage point without knowing how you would do it, I guess leverage sort of implies that we know the actions that we could take to achieve those outcomes. And I'm curious if there are any policies or thoughts that the people in the Fable Consortium had thought about in terms of how that would be actionable. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And also just to say, sorry, I'm not with you all. I know it's less good having an online presentation. So we don't have all the answers because we do stop at the point of, okay, here's our modeling outputs. And then we try, however, to work with policy teams in country to help them design interventions that might be effective. And so some countries, the UK, for example, are flagging that there's good healthy diet recommendations that seem to be helping people to understand the benefits of shifting towards more plant-based diets. And so certainly coming up with national and then locally relevant recommendations for what to eat seems to be part of the solution. And then also, this is not something exactly we've done with Fable, but we're seeing through the discussions with country teams in the Fable network, public procurement seems also a really promising avenue, and helping schools to adopt healthy diets from early on, and more plant-based diets seems another promising route. But we need to move on to that next stage to really get the answers for how we implement indeed.
Thank you. Laura? Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Laura Pereira here from the GCI at WITS. Just two questions and reflections. I noticed when you had the differentiation of the countries that the ones sort of at the top were largely Arctic. It was Russia, Finland, Sweden, Canada. And the ones that were sitting below that were in the tropics, Mexico, South Africa. And just, wondering how useful that classification really is in terms of crop, agricultural land use, because I'm not seeing how much we're actually going to be growing in the Arctic anytime soon. So just wondering whether there's just some correlation there that might need to be unpacked. And secondly, afforestation as a really big leverage point. When you're looking at biodiversity outcomes, and this is just something we've written up from the African regional group, is if you're going to start planting trees where they weren't previously in savannas and grasslands, you're going to have a much dire impact on biodiversity, on your water table, and various other things. And yet, that tends to be the narrative when we're looking at carbon, because we're not looking at below ground storage, we're looking at trees and forests and above ground processes. So yeah, just a bit of a reflection on that A versus reforestation aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, very, very good questions and points. So for the first one, the countries that are included do capture the biggest exporters and importers of food globally in general. So that's kind of the reason why they're selected in terms of the country representation. But we are looking for more partners from Africa because, we have 3 countries that are included from Africa, but there's large swathes of the tropics in Africa which are not represented, and this is a shortcoming. It is something that we'd like to do better on, actually, for making reasonable assumptions about what's possible in particularly the African tropics. And then the question about afforestation, Yeah, there was a paper, I think came out this week or last week, showing exactly that, grasslands are very important for biodiversity and shouldn't be underestimated. And so indeed, we found that afforestation is really important, but it's also partly because that was something that country teams were kind of playing to achieve because of the bond targets and the Paris Agreement. And so certainly restoration in terms of grassland is also something that is in our scenarios, but could be amplified, and I think is indeed part of the solution. But how we do close the gap and reach these targets, doing restoration actions beyond forested areas, previously forested areas, is going to be really important. And also increasing tree cover and natural habitat on farmland it needs to be part of the solution as well, it looks like, to have any chance of achieving the targets.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. So thank you. And the next speaker is Susanna Harmattskova from Czech Globe. I pronounce it wrongly, so probably. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Rob, can I get the pointer? Is it this way?
There's this. I don't think there is a pointer,
but it works like this?
It works
like
that.
It does. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. David, if you're going to use that bell, please warn me first, because I'll freak out, I swear. All right. Yeah, thanks everyone for the opportunity to present our work here. Susanna Harmattskova, and I'd like to present work that we have done with colleagues and friends at the Czech Academy of Sciences and in Stockholm Resilience Center. And the whole presentation is going to be about value-based participatory scenario co-development, particularly scenarios that are related to biodiversity and climate change. And as you will see, the storyline goes first about the description of the actual study and then some lessons learned that we derived from that. So the overall motivation for the study that we did is that when we think about scenarios, we tend to think about the uncertainties that are related to the future. And the chain of thinking usually is that we as people have values and other types of motivations that then drive us to different decisions and to different policies at a larger scale. And these in turn lead to specific actions, and those actions are the things that are driving us from present to the future. And at least in my understanding, why we do scenarios is that they help us think about the complexities of the present and help us kind of like uncover the chain from the values and motivations through decisions and actions to the futures. And because I've taken part in different BES assessments in the past, the reviews of scenarios that we have done have kind of like clearly shown us that we can see the part of the chain from decisions to the futures covered quite well. But where there is the gap is the values and motivations of people in those scenarios. So in the study that I'm going to present, I want to show how we try to address that gap. The approach that we took is that we tried to look at this chain from the perspective of values. We used a so-called life framework of values to help us distinguish between different types of values for nature. And we used the Three Horizons framework to connect the values with actions and the present with the future. We applied this approach in several protected areas in the Czech Republic, which is a country in Eastern Europe, and that comes into question later, and you will see why. In terms of the process, what we did is that we collaborated with multiple groups of stakeholders and experts across different protected areas in the country to see what are their values for the area that they either professionally or personally relate to, and what types of attitudes and actions these values lead them to. And in the second turn, we tried to work with them to translate these attitudes and actions to potential future impacts of these actions on nature, nature's contributions to people, and people's quality of life. And finally, we worked with the stakeholders to try to uncover the convergencies and the divergencies between the values and between the pathways that these values help us uncover. And here's where the descriptive part of the story ends, because basically what this study showed us was that indeed, when we look at future pathways and future scenarios, and when we look at the convergences and divergences between different pathways, values really help us understand not only what are the divergences, but also why they happen. So here we concluded that value-based participatory scenario co-development really is a useful tool when we want to address scenarios of biodiversity and climate change. But then there is the however, because after all the workshops, all the interactions that we have done with tens of stakeholders throughout several years, we kind of like repeatedly got a message from the stakeholders saying that, well, we don't want any change, and there's basically no point trying doing anything. And that was such like a stark difference to, first, what we are learning from scenario literature in general, and second, from our own experience from multiple different contexts, including Western Europe, including Global South, and so on. And our feeling was that from the literature and from other contexts, we are getting the message that actors are advocating for change, that actors do demand participation and like participatory development of scenarios and like acting upon them. So basically our question was, what is going on? Like why we are learning from the literature that values and people's motivations are like a valuable entry point to future scenarios. Why are we getting the message here that this is something that is not sparking people's thinking or people's agency to act on sustainability pathways? And we went back to our stakeholders and did tons of interviews. And I would like to present you with the understanding that we have gained and just offer it to you and ask for any feedback that you might have. So to kind of like describe our understanding now after this iteration, I think it boils down to a central question whether the value-based scenarios that we are developing or that the literature is guiding us to develop based on the values of nature, whether that is the right layer of values that we should be focusing on. Scenario literature tells us that participatory scenario co-development helps us to identify what are points or interventions for change, and the scenario literature tells us that this is something that will help us to enact that change in practice. And in general, the literature kind of like agrees that participation and involvement of different stakeholders is something that should help us in that respect. And recently, the opinion has appeared that if we manage to kind of like tap into actors' values for nature, that is something that will help us to kind of like enact this chain better or more effectively. But we are getting multiple different frameworks as a guidance how to navigate those values for nature across different contexts. But what we would like to, the point that we would like to make here is that the values that might play a role into whether the scenario co-development and the identification of leverage points and the enacting of change in practice, whether all that is actually happening. The types of values that might help us with that might not be values for nature, but general values of stakeholders for how society should work, how society should operate. So we would like to argue that values do matter, but we might want to focus on different types of values. I'll bring in a quick example. So for instance, if we are looking at specific sustainability challenges, unsustainable practices in agriculture, we generally think that we want some kind of change in the society to address those challenges. So the first question is whether there is motivation for any kind of pro-sustainability change among the actors. And that does depend on values, but there are very broad values, such as whether the society prefers a proactive or reactive approach, or whether the society as a whole is aligned with the idea that we need to change as a society or not. And based on that, we either have a society or actors which feel that they are ready and they are willing to initiate change, and then we have a chance to get to sustainability solutions. But on the other hand, with some actors and some societies, such as those ones in Eastern Europe, you can see that the mainstream narrative among actors is that the society needs to change first. we as individual actors, we as groups are not here to initiate change. And in such situations, you might be asking, okay, so then if the society needs to change first, what is the motivation for the society to do it? Who is going to push for that? Are we willing to aggregate, to push that kind of like larger scale change in the society? And once again, that motivation depends on broad values in the society, whether the society as a whole does acknowledge community solutions or group solutions, or whether the society prefers individualism, for instance. And based on that, once again, either we are getting actors or societal context that is ready to initiate some kind of larger scale systemic change, or we are getting stakeholders or actors or societies which are telling us we are not going to get involved. We don't want to aggregate, to advocate for change. And in those cases, what we are trying to illustrate here is that in those cases, the values for nature as such might not make any difference because the broader values in those societies are actually working against any kind of like pro-sustainability solutions. And once again, I would like to highlight that we believe this is something that we need to take into account when we work with scenarios and when we work with sustainability pathways, because the context, the broader societal context and the broader societal values decide a lot about whether the process of building the scenarios and the process of enacting the scenarios will work. And finally, that brings me to the conclusions that values do matter in developing scenarios. But the question is, which values are those? And he would like to just maybe invite the community to consider the different types of guidances that we are getting in scenario literature and see if we get all the guidance that we need. Because when it comes to the specific values for nature, we do get guidance, for instance, from the Nature's Future Framework or from the framework that we used in our study, which is the Life Framework for Values. And these two products are promoted by IIASA, one by the Scenarios and Models Task Force, one by the Values Assessment. But in general, they tend to focus on the question of nature, on the question of values for nature. And what we would like to illustrate here is that there are broader values for the operation of the society that might be those ones that we might want to tap into when we talk about value-based scenario development and enacting the sustainability pathways. And those are values such as whether the society as a whole prefers solidarity versus individual solutions to things, whether the society values active approach or passive approach to citizenship in general, whether people prefer to exercise own agency or whether they prefer to follow strong leaders, whether flexibility is valued in society or whether resistance to change is something that's valued more, whether we are operating in a society that prefers commonality and that looks at similarities between people, or whether it's a society which values opposition. Whether it's in general an individualistic society or a society that prefers communal solutions, and so on and so on. So these are just a few of the examples that we got from our stakeholders when we were doing the follow-up interviews to our series of workshops. But I would like to stop here and just offer it as a point for discussion later. Thank you very much.
Time for 1, 2 questions. Laura.
Thanks, Susanna. I can't leave you without a question after that one. I was just sort of wanting to link into this idea of sort of co-production of scenarios, thinking about the future, and this idea of enacting a pathway, right? Because I think that there's a bit of a disjunction how some of the literature talks about, because like the transformations literature talks a lot about agency and whether if you got like the head of WTO and World Bank and Elon Musk, heaven forbid, all in a room to sort of talk through things, you'll see a whole lot of different values surfacing and the kind of directionality would be different. And there might be agency in that room to actually change some of those more sort of structural systemic factors, whereas you can understand that on the ground, there would be a lot of lack of agency of like, well, this is great, but I can't actually shift anything, but I can maybe tell you the direction that I would find more preferable based on these different kinds of values of what it is we want. So just trying to unpack a little bit more like that notion when you say enacting sustainability pathways and connecting to scenario development. Unpack that a little bit more.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks. And yes, I think, this is something that we have been trying to wrap our kind of like minds around a lot. And I do agree that they are like two different steps maybe. That's, I was hoping that, that's captured in this scheme. But in general, when we read scenario literature, I think it gives us the message that the reason why we are doing scenarios, one of many, but among others, is the one that we want to kind of like believe that it triggers some kind of societal change. Like one of the motivations that people, especially in literature about participatory scenarios, kind of like often acknowledge is this one, So that's why I guess this was connected in our thinking, because it's the kind of scenarios that kind of like gives that promise, or tends to give that promise sometimes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Susanna. Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Marie Casala from University of Sao Paulo. Just ready. This one is just forwards, backwards.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity to share part of the work that we have done on the scenarios of the sustainable use of wild species. So I am Maria Casala from the University of São Paulo, Brazil, and I'm here representing also Derek Tichensor, who is in the audience, and also Jean-Marc Fromentin, Marla Emery, and John Donaldson, that worked with me as coordinating lead author and co-chairs of this work, as well as several other contributors. Yes, scenarios of climate change and biodiversity are very common for implications and trade-off of different policies, things like that, but particularly for nature contribution to people regarding natural resources, they are more rare. And the Intergovernmental Policy Science Interface on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, had provided some guidance, as you see in the morning session today, on scenarios and models, and also in the global assessment, some sort of scenarios. And recently, there was this assessment on sustainable use. It was a thematic assessment, but it is still confidential. So it's just some exclusive comments that we can share with you, because it will be approved in the next plenary, which we're gonna have in 2 weeks now, I think. So what we're going to share, would like to share with the scenarios community are some points, not the real outcomes of the scenarios, but just some particular interesting comments for the scenarios community to consider. Okay. Yes. So this assessment covers practices, including fishing, gathering, logging, terrestrial animal harvesting, and non-extractive uses as well, just like observing or tourism, and covers land, ocean, and freshwater systems, and also more than 8 types of use of wild species. And there was a chapter, which is chapter 5, on scenarios. And in that work, we use and we also had this systematic literature review and coding. It was a team particularly doing all this coding work. And then with all this information, we use this C+C framework applied to extract the main, from the scenarios literature, the main kind of drivers of sustainable use from the scenarios literature. And C+C here means social, technological, ecological, economic, political, and cultural aspects or kind of drivers. And the general outcome identified were some serious gaps in sustainable use scenarios. So sustainable use itself is not very well covered in scenarios literature. And the scenarios that are most common weighted heavily towards fishing and forestry, and climate change a key driver across the practices. But even in fishing and forestry, climate change and the projections and scenarios are mostly related to climate change, demand, but not really on the sustainable use itself. Yes, so in this chapter we also use the NFF, which is the Nature Future Framework, but just providing some examples considering fishing and forestry or logging examples, looking at how this framework can be applied to provide sustainable use, such like in fishery management, for instance, or also, we had also a case study on Amazon, also bioeconomy, okay? And so we use this just for recommendation and advice on how you can use it to provide, to promote, foster sustainable use. But we also use the archetype scenarios that was also presented in the morning session. And so what we did was to use this concept and try to adapt to the sustainable use and looking for solutions in different sustainability, in different contexts. And unfortunately, I can't share the scenarios themselves yet, but what we can really share is that no matter the different context that we consider, there are always actions towards sustainable use. So there are several different types of actions that can be done whenever, no matter in which scenario. And also what was very interesting was to explore indigenous people and local communities scenarios. The literature is not, it's really poor, but there are some communities assessments and documents that were used to provide examples. And there are examples in both developed and developing countries regarding the use of, the role of these communities in sustainable use, and it was pretty important because we found out that knowledge, practices, and beliefs guide sustainable use of wild species in many communities. So it was really interesting to explore. And these kind of scenarios are still scarce, but very important to be explored. So this is why we really like to share with the scenario community that this is something that needs to be better explored in future assessments. Well, as key knowledge gaps, of course, as I mentioned before, scenarios of practices beyond fishing and logging, and also cultural aspects of the sustainable use in scenarios. And the integration of sustainable use into more general sustainability scenarios beyond biodiversity laws, which means that a lot of scenarios focus on biodiversity laws, on numbers of species, but it's not very common to have scenarios regarding the sustainable use. And also socio-economic, ecological aspects need to be better covered. Well, so as summary and conclusions, the IPB Sustainable Use Assessment includes a chapter on future scenarios. Please stay tuned on the launch and read the chapter 5, send us comments on that. And also please consider that we try to integrate multiple scenarios framework, including archetypes and the NFF, and critical reflection also on inequalities that we find pretty important for sustainable use considerations globally and regionally. Many sustainable use knowledge gaps identified. Also, we describe pathways towards sustainability in the different practices, and the role of IPLC in scenarios was also highlighted. So broadening the set of scenarios for sustainable use will enable greater exploration of desirable futures, and sustainable use is key. So it's not just protected areas. Yeah, so I'd like to thank the whole team of authors. In red, the ones that are here in this conference, in the Scenarios Forum. So appreciate the work of all of them, including fellows, contributing authors, review editors, the IPBES TSU, and also the IIASA Scenarios Forum team for having us here and support this presentation. So thank you. Thank you very much.
I wouldn't want you to divulge any of the important findings from the document, but just from a methodological perspective, I'm just really interested, how did you deal with Indigenous and local knowledge within the context of scenarios? What was the method you went through to deal with that sort of quite often tacit knowledge held by ILK holders?
Yes. First of all, we need, the literature review, as in all the assessments. And for scientific, there were some scientific literature looking at this kind of knowledge. So there are a few, but they were incorporated. But we also look at community plans, because indigenous people and local communities they also submit to IPBES their report on community plans. So the coding team looking at the literature also look at these community plans from IPLC. Yeah, but in general, the literature is really poor. In the experience that we have, there are several initiatives. We found out that there are many initiatives globally looking at scenarios from the point of view of these communities. So I think, I don't know if Derek would like to share anything else, but I think it's very important to see their role on this kind of vision for sustainable use. So I really recommend the scenarios community to look at those kind of knowledge as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker is remote again. That's Olivier Maury from IRD in France. Please, if you have the presentation, there it is.
Good morning, everyone. I am Olivier Maury and I work in IRD in Sète in the south of France. Today, my co-authors, Directed Answer, Julia Blanchard, Tyler Reddy and myself would like to talk about the Ocean System Pathways, the OSPs, a set of scenarios designed for driving marine ecosystems and fisheries models. This work is being conducted in the framework of the Fisheries and Marine Ecosystem Model Intercomparison Project, FISHMIP, in collaboration with FAO. FISHMIP is part of ISIMIP, the Inter-Sectoral Impact Model Intercomparison Project, that is organizing model intercomparison exercises in various sectors, from agriculture to water, energy, or forest. FISHMIP is the marine ecosystems and fisheries component of ISIMIP. What is FishMIP doing? FishMIP is developing simulation protocols to coordinate model intercomparisons in the marine ecosystem model community. These are useful to identify and study the bioecological processes involved in the impact of climate on ecosystems and for improving the models. FishMIP is also providing projections envelopes to the general public and to science policy endeavors such as the IPCC and the IPBES. To date, FishMIP's work has been used in the IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate, the IPBES Global Biodiversity Assessments, and the recent IPCC Working Group 2 report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So far, FishMIP has mostly focused on projecting the impacts of climate change on marine ecosystems. For that purpose, we have used outputs of climate models, here, driven by the SSPs through atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations, pathways to force our marine ecosystem models. There is now a need to move from simulating ecosystems to simulating social ecosystems in order to project the future of fisheries. For this purpose, we will couple our marine ecosystem models to bioeconomic fleet dynamics model that simulate the dynamics of fishing effort and market models that simulate prices and trades. These socio-economic models need economic, governance, and management drivers that are not specified in SSPs. As we will see, these are specified quantitatively in the SSP-based Ocean System Pathways Framework. The Ocean System Pathways put the SSP scenarios in the context of marine fisheries. The storylines were first developed during a workshop in UNESCO in 2013, focused on oceanic fisheries. The workshop involved scientists from various fields, representatives from the European fishing industry, and international organizations. The OSPs identify and describe the evolution of the major driving forces of the fisheries systems in the three economic, governance, management domains. For instance, in the economic domain here, the OSPs describe the evolution of wild fish demand and fishing costs. More recently, in the FishMIP context, we organized a workshop with FAO in 2019 to extend the OSPs to global fisheries, including oceanic fisheries, demersal and benthic fisheries, small pelagic fisheries, and emerging fisheries, as well as aquaculture. The new extended storylines were designed to be consistent with SSPs from national to sub-regional, regional, and global scales, according to the geographical breakdown of the IPBES. Following, we have turned the storylines into quantitative models drivers that are needed to drive the FishMIP coupled marine ecosystems and fisheries simulation models. Finally, this extended OSP framework will be made available to the community to derive scenario-based ecosystem and fisheries model envelope projections. Up to now, we have used outputs of SSP-driven climate models to drive the FishMIP marine ecosystem models scenario projections. In order to simulate the dynamics of prices along these scenarios, we turn the OSP storylines into a first set of meta drivers. These include and combine together SSP outputs, such as the GDP and population per country, as well as the OSP-derived geographic structure of markets and the tariffs applied. These meta drivers, one, drive what we call a mini-market model. The mini-market model is a very simple model designed to be coupled to any ecosystem model. At each time step, it provides prices and incomes, given catches, and the meta drivers one. In the same way, in order to simulate the dynamics of fishing effort and catches, we turn the OSP storylines into a second set of meta drivers. These include and combine together all the cost time series, as well as catchability trends and fisheries management rules derived from the OSPs. These meta drivers too drive what we call a mini-fleet model that is coupled to the ecosystem model. The mini-fleet model calculates fishing effort at every time step given prices and incomes from the mini-market model and meta drivers too. Finally, the ecosystem model calculates catches given fishing effort and biomass. So to recap, what is the mini-market model? It is an OSP-driven demand function that is embedded into the ecosystem model to calculate prices and incomes given catches at every time step. Its parameters have been estimated using past catches and prices data for the 4 commodities considered in the OSPs. So you are here the 4 commodities: small pelagics, large pelagics, demersal, as well as aquaculture. You have on the left hand side, you have the demand, the catches. You have the price here and the demand functions on the right. And you see that we have fit the demand functions on the data so that we can use the model with the estimated parameters for making projections. What is the mini-fleet model? It is a dynamic bioeconomic model embedded in the ecosystem model and based on incomes and costs. It calculates the dynamics of fishing effort given prices and incomes and the OSP context that is encapsulated in the meta drivers too. The OSPs consider explicitly artisanal and industrial fishing fleets. The OSP framework is structured spatially. It articulates national, sub-regional, regional, and global scales according to the geographical breakdown of the IPBES. It means that prices can be formed at any scale according to the level of geographic aggregation of markets that is specified in each OSP. And effort dynamics can also be calculated at any scale. The quantity of sea products consumed can then be back calculated for every country worldwide. The simulation protocol that will be proposed to the FishMIP community at the end of this year has 2 phases. First of all, the marine ecosystem modeling community will be provided with the mini-fleet and mini-market computer codes to be embedded in ecosystem models, as well as the corresponding meta drivers 1 and 2. Then, historical prices, efforts, biomasses, and catches will be simulated from 1960 to 2010 and compared to observations for assessing the ability of the framework to reproduce the past. Then, in a second phase, projections for the 5 OSPs will be made from 2011 to 2100. And you see here on these graphs the trajectories of biomasses, of catches for both types of fleets, as well as the effort here and prices here that can be simulated by the framework, both on the historical and on the scenario periods. Let's now recap for the conclusion. FishMIP has coordinated global marine ecosystem models intercomparison, which have simulated contributions from a growing number of modeling teams. These intercomparisons have led to original process studies, as well as productions ensembles that have contributed to IPCC and IPBES reports. We are now in the process of extending these SSP-based ecosystem projections to include fisheries, and we developed the OSP Scenario Framework in this perspective. It includes storylines, quantitative drivers, and mini-models, from national to global scales. It covers oceanic, demersal, and small pelagic fisheries, as well as aquaculture. and it includes artisanal and industrial fisheries. And finally, it considers economy, governance, and management. With all of these ends, we hope to be in a position to produce OSP-driven fisheries protection envelopes in 2023. It is now the end of the talk. Thank you very much for your attention, and sorry not to be physically with you today. I will now answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Olivier. Hi there, Olivier. So, are there any questions from the audience? Any? Willem? Over there?
Thanks a lot, Olivier, for the talk and the insights into the fisheries scenario. So, we've recently done some work related to fisheries in Western Africa, especially Guinea-Bissau, and there was quite some discussion there about the validity of a lot of the FAO data series related to fish catches. And especially there were some articles suggesting that somewhere around 50% of the catch was basically not accounted for in FAO statistics across the kind of full Western Africa coast. I was curious how, well, if that's a kind of, if you could reflect on data uncertainties related to fish catches, and if that's something that you can account for in these model exercises.
Thank you for the question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Thank you, and sorry not to be with you, and sorry also for the quite monotonous tone of the talk. Actually, I made the recording when my kids were sleeping, so I couldn't speak very loudly in the room. Yes, thanks for your question. The quality of the fisheries data is indeed often a problem, and especially in countries in the south, it's often difficult to have complete data sets. So we have worked with the official data from the FAO indeed, but there are also reconstructions, extrapolations, and estimations of the data. For instance, I can cite the Sea Around Us program that has made such reconstruction. There are others that can be used to compare to the official data sets and to see if gaps are there. But overall, we have quite good estimations of at least of the orders of magnitude for the catches.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Olivier. A quick question on the future of OSPs. So if I understand well, the idea is still to generate explorative scenarios that are prolongating the storylines of the SSPs into the ocean. I was wondering whether you were already thinking of also exploring scenarios that are more normative, in a sense, are trying to reach specific goals.
Thanks, David, for the question. Yes, that was indeed the plan, and it is still the plan, but at the moment, the fish meal community, you know, it is quite slow to, and Derek could comment on that, of course, it is quite slow to move with the community. It's not a single team, it's many modeling teams working together. So the way it works at the moment is that we are simulating past data, historical simulations, to validate the models, and we have a protocol for that. And once this is complete, at the end of this year, hopefully, then we will move to these OSP protocol scenario for the next round of simulations. And we think it should be developed during 2023. And then the scenario working group, and you will be contacted for that, will likely move toward more target-seeking scenarios and maybe bending the curve type of scenarios. That's something that we have still to discuss within the group, but that's indeed the initial plan. And we also want to keep in touch with FAO in this respect to align with their needs as well.
Thank you very much, Olivier. Yeah, well, we're running out of time, so it's the one small question.
Okay, yes.
Thanks.
And
Hi,
hopefully
Olivier.
a small answer as well.
Okay, so no need to answer. It's just an invite. Congratulations for your work, and we'd like to invite you also to come to our Blue Scenario session tomorrow at 11 a.m. So I hope that you can be also there, joining the group and the discussions. Thanks.
I will, of course, Maria, I will.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes.
And now we go for the last presentation by Bernd Lenzer from University of Vienna. Please go ahead. No, it works just okay.
Great. Yeah, thanks everyone for sticking around so long. And I'm going to talk about biological invasions today, which we can as well call the neglected driver of biodiversity scenarios. And I'll talk a bit about what's up with that. So, I mean, we all know this, that's why we are in the session. Global environmental change poses a lot of threats to biodiversity, and these threats are related to socioeconomic changes and environmental changes that put pressures on biodiversity. And as you are probably all aware of, the global assessment identified a set of major drivers, so 5 major drivers of biodiversity change or biodiversity loss. And among these 5 drivers, you can see in green invasive alien species. From a scenarios perspective, alien species stick out quite strongly because it's actually the only one where there aren't any global scenarios available at the moment, compared to others related for climate change, of course, or we have land use scenarios and so on. So why is that the case? Or biological invasions have mainly been neglected because there was a shortage of data which has been started to close up in the last 10 or 5 to 10 years. And because of this lack of scenarios and the change in the data availability, we developed a framework for scenarios and models of biological invasions, and this was actually based on work I did here at IIASA together with David and a lot of other people, and we developed this scenario framework for biological invasions, highlighting the key points and challenges along the way to getting from data availability to operational scenarios in the end. And so we are very much advancing at these historic trends and status quo data that are available now in large global databases. And now we can go the step further to develop narratives and eventually models, and then provide scenarios or views into the future. But before developing these scenarios or storylines, there have been some initiatives which resulted from the Alien Scenarios project I'm working in, and mainly from work from Hanno Sebens and colleagues, where there were some projections of future trends of invasive species into the future based on historic trends. So this is what we call this business as usual scenario for biological invasions into the future, where we basically project the trends, the historic trends into the future without assuming significant changes in these trends in the future. And there are a lot of lines, a lot of information. What you can see is we see an increase in invasive species across taxonomic groups and across geographic regions. And what we find in the study is that we project an increase of about 36% of established alien species numbers per continent by 2050. So it's quite a strong increase of established alien species and subsequent impacts that might be associated with the establishment of these species. Beyond this first quantitative projection, we as well did a survey among experts of biological invasions, where we asked these experts to think about what are the major impacts on biodiversity for different contexts. And we asked the question, what is the threshold, in their opinion, of proportional increase from current state biological invasions to cause major impacts on biodiversity. Major impacts here are defined as substantial change in community composition, so regarding local extinctions, for example, and substantial changes in ecosystem properties, so for example, the loss of function of ecosystems. And we asked this question for different contexts, so for example, different realms, different taxonomic groups, different biomes, different socioeconomic contexts. And what we see here, or what we got from this graph, is that these experts assessed about a 20 to 30% increase of biological invasions will likely cause major impacts of global biodiversity. And if you recall the figure from the slide before, under a business as usual scenario, we even expect an increase of 26% of alien species numbers in the future. That is numbers, not impacts, but still it exemplifies or shows the severity of biological invasions on biodiversity in the future. In the same study, we as well explored asked the experts what are the major drivers of future invasive alien species impacts across all contexts. And what we find was a pattern like this. So the most important drivers experts in biological invasions or invasion science identified in the future are related to socioeconomic activity and trade and transport and climate change. So these drivers most strongly drive biological invasions in the future. These are followed by other, mainly socioeconomic drivers like land use, land cover change, demography and migration, and recreation and tourism. So drivers related to the distribution of goods and people around the world. So socioeconomic activities will mainly drive future biological invasions. These will potentially link, could be a potential link to existing models for biodiversity or scenarios of biodiversity where we might integrate biological invasions into these global biodiversity models. Because these scenarios were based on expert opinion or on projecting trends that have been based on historic data, we then went a step further and developed the first global alien species narratives of biological invasions to get a better understanding or overview of how this might turn out in the future. So in a workshop context, we defined a set of drivers of biological invasions that were then rated along this uncertainty and relevance axis for changes in biological invasions in the future. And we selected a subset of drivers to develop storylines for biological invasions within the 21st century until 2050. This exercise followed this well-established two-axis approach where we selected two drivers as axes, where we then developed 4 subsequent scenarios for these extreme directions of these drivers. This resulted in a set of 16 scenarios, and these were built along these two axes, but as well taking into account the trend and development of different scenario variables, of course. And then these were linked to the risk and the trends in biological invasions in the future, which are highlighted here in the yellow to red boxes, from a low decrease to a high increase of biological invasions into the future. And these scenarios were then grouped into could then be grouped into scenario families. So with that, we established the first kind of set of global biological invasions, or the narratives for biological invasions. What we then as well did in the study, which was led by Nuria Pascual and was published last year, so you can go into the paper to get more details, was to look on how the global alien species narratives link up with the SSPs based on the scenario variables used in both scenario initiatives. What we did here is we projected the SSPs onto the invasive alien species option space and then ran a cluster analysis. And just shortly, you can see here in black the SSPs. We can see that we identified 4 clusters for the biological invasion scenarios, and the SSP link up with 3 of these 4 clusters. So what we get from this activity is kind of the result that the SSP cover only parts of the scenario space relevant for biological invasions, which as well links up to these comments made in the plenary already, that these scenarios developed around the climate community are probably not capturing all the relevant space and scenario space relevant for biodiversity change, or here more explicitly for biological invasions. In a subsequent activity which is ongoing, so we downscaled these alien species narratives in a workshop approach as well to the European context. So what we did, we established a workflow for downscaling these global storylines to the European context. So again, we had a set of experts from different backgrounds at the European level, and these were put into groups, and each group selected one of the 16 global scenarios within these 4 families and downscaled these scenarios to the European level, leading us to 4 European alien species narratives. And for these narratives, we scored the magnitude of change by 2050 for 26 variables that are widely used in scenario exercises. So this workflow was deemed successful in a way that we got these European narratives, so it worked out in the workshop context, and we anticipate a very high transferability to other relevant contexts. So this is a workflow that can be used to develop biological invasion scenarios on other continents, at the country or at the local scale. And we of course encourage people to try to take this up and develop scenarios in different contexts. So the European alien species narratives, just to go very quickly and not into too much detail, but these are around related to different ways on how the world looks like. So we have one which is more related to increasing isolation, so the Lost in Europe scenario. We have one which is very technology related, so big tech rules Europe. We have the green local governance scenario and the technological pseudo-panacea scenario, and all these scenarios have different storylines, of course, and they are all associated to different levels of anticipated biological invasions in the future. What we then did, or what we're doing in this publication, is we compare the global to the European alien scenarios narratives. You can see this here. So we have this set of 26 scenario variables at the bottom, and then we have this, the global and the European alien species narratives. What we can see here is that the European narratives cluster with their global counterpart, which is not surprising because they were derived from this global counterpart. But what we can see here highlighted in the black boxes is that we see some kind of variation where the European scenarios deviate from the global context, and the global context to capture these variation. It's nice to be the last one, I can be a bit longer. So yeah, the outcome is as expected, but there is some variation in individual scenario variables which can be explained for the different contexts. We as well compared them to the SSPs at the European, at the global level, but I'm not going into detail here, so you need to wait for the paper or catch me in a break. So the big question now with these preliminary works is how to integrate biological invasions into biodiversity models. So for example, models like the Bending the Curve initiative, where can we link biological invasions in there? And one way, for example, could be to establish a link to trade as or trade, transportation, and economics in these models. To bring this to a conclusion, some take-home messages. Biological invasions at the moment are a missing major driver, or the missing major driver in global scenario efforts for biodiversity change. But now the global alien scenario narratives are available, so we can move this forward and we can develop this work. There is a workflow for downscaling these global scenarios, so we encourage people to apply this in different contexts. And of course, a vision in the long run would be, for example, to establish something like an IIASA MIP initiative where we can compare models or scenarios of biological invasions from different groups. Existing scenario narratives like the SSP only cover parts of the scenario space relevant for biological invasions, which is a very important take-home message. and the integration of biological invasions into existing scenario approaches will be the next step. And the question is how can we achieve this, and with existing models, but as well how can we map, for example, the alien species narratives onto the NFFs, and I would be happy to discuss this at some point during the next days. With that, I'm done, and I want to thank a lot of people, a lot of funding bodies. Check out the webpage of the Alien Scenarios project if you're interested. I have as well as some of these fun flyers, which are from the beginning of the project. I'm happy to share these with interested people, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. So we run out of time anyway, so are there any questions? Any questions in the Paula? And then you.
I can just make it really quick, just because I'm sure you're probably already involved in the IIASA assessment on the invasive alien species. So how much of this has come in time to get into that assessment, and how much of it is unfortunately going to miss the literature cutoff date? So we need another one in another IIASA program 5 years hence.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. I mean, the project came quite in time, so we have the global storylines in there. The Europeans one are still in preparation, and there is as well an extension to develop management strategies for the European scenarios. These, unfortunately, are not covered in the IIASA assessment, but I am as well part of the invasive alien species assessment, leading the scenarios and models liaison group. So there is a cross-cutting theme in the assessment where we're looking at scenarios and models across all chapters. And there was a big literature review as well there, where we looked at the literature that includes scenarios and their quantifications, so all publications dealing with models and scenarios. And maybe as a teaser, there is a lot to do. There is a lot of work to do. Most of the scenarios are often related to climate change trends, correlative scenarios, but we are really lacking information at the process scale or at the target-seeking scales, not only because we are missing the targets yet, so we hope with the post-2020 targets that we have some numeric goals for invasions as well, in contrast to the IG target 9, where there is only a qualitative goal. So there is a lot going on in the scenarios, part of the IIASA assessment. And of course, I encourage you to read it once it's out.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I give the last word for David to close the session.
Thanks a lot for your patience. So, as promised, we have taken you through a broad range of ecosystems, freshwater, land, marine, and so on, spatial scales, temporal scales, different drivers of biodiversity. The idea was really to go very broad and cover as much as we can of what the biodiversity community is doing. Two things to say to that. The travel is not finished yet, and so there are still 2 posters to look at in the poster session. Please go right away if you want to. And the second thing is that this is a very much opening moment. Now there is a second moment towards the end of this conference, which is about discussing interaction with the SSP and SCP framework. That's a workshop on Wednesday at 11 in the Marshall-Zimmer 1, I think. And so please take all of this with you in your heads and try to condense that into a few points to bring back to that workshop around the interaction with the SSP-SCP framework. I will try to steer that discussion a little bit through the discussion document, but yeah, it's mostly up to you to process all of that now. Thank you very much and enjoy the evening.